The Departed. Hollywood spent years and a small fortune buying the rights to a Hong Kong cop thriller most American audiences had never even heard of. And then it went and won Best Picture. The film is The Departed, a 2006 crime drama directed by Martin Scorsese, and it's a remake of the 2002 Hong Kong sensation Infernal Affairs, directed by Andrew Lau and Alan Mak. Screenwriter William Monahan took the original's premise, a cop deep undercover in the mob and a mole deep inside the police, and dragged the whole thing across the ocean to South Boston. The cast Scorsese assembled is almost unfair. Leonardo DiCaprio, Matt Damon, Jack Nicholson, Mark Wahlberg, Martin Sheen, Vera Farmiga, and Alec Baldwin. Monahan loosely folded in real Boston history, including crime boss Whitey Bulger, who became the blueprint for Nicholson's terrifying Frank Costello. Here's the thing that made the remake feel so unnecessary. Infernal Affairs wasn't some forgotten dud waiting to be fixed. It was a critical and commercial knockout in Hong Kong, widely considered one of the finest crime films of its era. So to a lot of fans, remaking it was like repainting a masterpiece. And yet The Departed walked away with 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Film Editing, and the big one, Best Director. The first and only directing Oscar of Scorsese's career, after decades of nominations. Now, whether the remake actually beats the original is a fight that still breaks out online. Plenty of people argue Infernal Affairs is tighter and sharper, and they've got a real case. But it's hard to call a movie unnecessary when it finally hands one of cinema's greatest directors the trophy he'd been chasing his entire life. Ocean's 11. Remaking a Rat Pack movie sounds like the definition of a vanity project, right up until you remember that almost nobody actually liked the original. Steven Soderbergh's Ocean's 11 landed in 2001, a remake of the 1960 caper starring Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. The 1960 version is fondly remembered, but mostly for the vibe of watching the coolest guys in the world hang out, not for being a sharp heist film. It actually underperformed, critically and commercially, next to the Rat Pack's other movies. Soderbergh's answer was to keep the wattage and add an actual screenplay, loading up with George Clooney, Brad Pitt, Matt Damon, Julia Roberts, Andy Garcia, Don Cheadle, Bernie Mac, and Elliot Gould. The result grossed about $450 million worldwide, making it the 5th highest-grossing film of the year. The critical gap tells the whole story. The 1960 version sits at 48% on Rotten Tomatoes, while the 2001 version sits at 82%. And where the original was a one-off, Soderbergh's launched a whole recurring franchise, 2 sequels, and a spin-off. This is the textbook example people reach for when they talk about a remake blowing past the original, because the so-called untouchable classic was never really that good. The remake didn't ruin a great movie. It fixed one that needed fixing. True Grit. John Wayne won the only Oscar of his entire career playing Rooster Cogburn. So when the Coen brothers announced they were doing it over, a lot of fans called it flat-out sacrilege. Their True Grit arrived in 2010, written and directed by Joel and Ethan Coen, the second screen adaptation of Charles Portis's 1968 novel. The 1969 original starred Wayne as the drunken, eye-patched marshal, the role that finally got him his Academy Award. The Coens handed Cogburn to Jeff Bridges, surrounded him with Matt Damon and Josh Brolin, and cast an unknown teenager named Haley Steinfeld as Maddie Ross. The film pulled in 10 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Actor for Bridges, in the exact role that had won Wayne his statue. It won none of the 10. But at the box office, it was a monster, grossing about $252 million worldwide and becoming one of the biggest westerns of the modern era. The original had grossed north of $30 million. The reason it worked is that the Coens didn't remake the John Wayne movie at all. They went back to Portis's novel and made a far more faithful adaptation, which meant there was a whole layer of the story the first film never touched. The angle here isn't that the remake buried Wayne, it's that both films are great for completely different reasons. Casino Royale. When Daniel Craig was announced as a blonde, blunt instrument James Bond, fans were so furious that websites literally sprang up to campaign for a boycott. Casino Royale came out in 2006 as a full reboot of the longest-running franchise in film, with Craig stepping in for his first outing. It followed Die Another Day from 2002 and the entire point was to strip out the invisible cars and the gadget-heavy excess and rebuild Bond as a younger, rawer, more vulnerable man. The story adapts Ian Fleming's very first Bond novel and adapts it faithfully, which is funny because that same source had once been turned into a 1967 spoof comedy that played the whole thing for laughs. The backlash was genuinely intense, and then the movie came out and ended the argument instantly. It earned about $599 million worldwide, and it stayed the highest-grossing Bond film ever until Skyfall passed it in 2012. Critics gave it a 94% on Rotten Tomatoes, praising Craig and the back-to-basics tone. A fifth different actor and a hard reset on a beloved series sounded unnecessary, even reckless, and it turned out to be the smartest move the franchise ever made. By the way, if you're enjoying this so far, I post videos like this all the time, and a subscribe would genuinely help the channel out. Thanks. The Fly. A 1950s creature feature about a man with a fly's head does not exactly scream remake material, until David Cronenberg got hold of it and turned it into a tragedy. Cronenberg's The Fly came out in 1986, a remake of the 1958 original that featured Vincent Price. In that first film, Price actually played a supporting role, while David Hedison played the scientist who meets the fly. Cronenberg threw out the campy tone entirely. His version stars Jeff Goldblum as Seth Brundle and Gina Davis as journalist Veronica Quaife, and instead of a sudden monster, it's a slow, agonizing body horror metamorphosis wrapped around a doomed love story. The transformation was so convincing that special effects artists Chris Walas and Stefan Dupuis won the Academy Award for Best Makeup. Commercially, it was a real hit, making about $60 million worldwide, which is roughly $174 million in today's money. Many critics thought Goldblum deserved more. Gene Siskel famously argued that Goldblum got stiffed out of a Best Actor nomination simply because Academy voters rarely honor horror. That's the whole story of why this one worked. The original was fun, the remake was devastating, and it mined real emotion out of a premise that had no business being that moving. Dune. The last time someone tried to put Dune on the big screen, the director disowned the finished movie, and it nearly torpedoed his career. So naturally, Hollywood handed Denis Villeneuve a blank check to go try it again. Villeneuve's Dune arrived in 2021, adapting roughly the first half of Frank Herbert's 1965 novel. The prior attempt was David Lynch's 1984 version, one of the most notorious box office bombs in blockbuster history. Lynch's film grossed about $30.9 million against a $40 million budget, and Lynch disowned it. A huge part of the problem was pacing. Lynch crammed the entire dense novel into roughly 2 hours and 16 minutes, while Villeneuve gave himself about 2 hours and 36 minutes to cover only half as much material. The newer version pulled this off even with a same-day streaming release during the pandemic, grossing around $400 million worldwide. It earned 10 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture and Best Adapted Screenplay, and won 6, among them Best Visual Effects, Best Cinematography, and Best Original Score. And here's a strange little detail. Both films were nominated for Best Sound, the one and only Oscar category the two versions actually share. The new cast was stacked too. Timothée Chalamet, Rebecca Ferguson, Oscar Isaac, Zendaya, and Javier Bardem. For decades, Dune carried the reputation of being unfilmable, and the proof was sitting right there in 1984. To be fair to Lynch, his version has since been reappraised as a cult favorite, but Villeneuve took the ultimate cursed project and turned it into a critical and commercial triumph. Dawn of the Dead. Remaking a George Romero zombie classic is the kind of move that gets horror fans sharpening their pitchforks, and then a music video director nobody had heard of went and pulled it off. Dawn of the Dead hit theaters in 2004, directed by Zack Snyder in his feature debut, and written by James Gunn, remaking Romero's 1978 horror landmark of the same name. Made on a budget of about $28 million, it grossed roughly $103 million worldwide, nearly 4 times its cost. Critics came around fast, landing it at 77% on Rotten Tomatoes, with the consensus calling it a surprisingly worthy take. It also launched 2 careers, putting Snyder on the map and setting Gunn on the path that would eventually lead to Guardians of the Galaxy. 2 unknowns took a swing at a sacred text and walked away with a hit. Scarface. Brian De Palma's Scarface got mediocre reviews and modest box office, and then spent the next 40 years quietly becoming one of the most quoted films ever made. It's a 1983 crime epic directed by De Palma and written by Oliver Stone, a loose remake of Howard Hawks' 1932 gangster classic. The whole thing started because Al Pacino watched the original, became obsessed, and pushed producer Martin Bregman to develop a new version. Sidney Lumet was actually attached to direct first, before De Palma replaced him. De Palma and Stone moved the story off the Prohibition-era streets of Chicago and dropped it into 1980s Miami and the Cuban cocaine trade. When it opened, it grossed about $66 million worldwide, and the reviews were rough, hammering the violence, the profanity, and the drug content. But over the following decades, it transformed into a genuine cultural phenomenon, endlessly quoted and referenced. De Palma even dedicated the film to the original's writers, Howard Hawks and Ben Hecht. This one is proof that worked doesn't always mean opening weekend. Sometimes it means the next 40 years. King Kong. Fresh off 3 Lord of the Rings films, Peter Jackson got handed a $200 million blank check to remake a movie from 1933. His King Kong came out in 2005, the second remake of the original, on a reported budget of about $207 million. It grossed over $550 million worldwide and won 3 Academy Awards for Best Visual Effects, Best Sound Editing, and Best Sound Mixing. The reason this worked when it could have easily embarrassed everyone is simple. Jackson had been a lifelong fan of the original, often citing it as the very reason he became a filmmaker. He loved the 1933 film so much that he was arguably the only person on Earth who could be trusted to redo it. 3. 10 to Yuma. Remaking a tight, beloved 1950s Western is a fast way to disappoint everyone, unless you cast Russell Crowe and Christian Bale and point them straight at each other. 3:10 to Yuma is a 2007 Western directed by James Mangold, a remake of the 1957 film, both based on an Elmore Leonard short story. Crowe plays the charming outlaw Ben Wade, and Bale plays the desperate rancher Dan Evans, tasked with getting him to a train. The remake landed at 88% on Rotten Tomatoes, though the original actually scores higher at 96%, and whether the new one truly improves on it is a genuine split among fans. It picked up 2 Academy Award nominations for Best Original Score and Best Sound Mixing, with critics praising the lead performances and Mangold's harder, more intense direction. The hook is simple. 2 of the era's best actors going head-to-head can revive an entire genre. Heat. One of the greatest crime films of the 90s is secretly a remake of a forgotten TV movie that the same director made 6 years earlier. Heat came out in 1995, written and directed by Michael Mann, and starring Al Pacino and Robert De Niro in their legendary face-off. What almost nobody realizes is that it's a remake of Mann's own 1989 TV movie, LA Takedown, which itself started life as a failed television pilot. Mann had originally written the script back in 1979, basing it on Chicago cop Chuck Adamson's real pursuit of a thief named Neil McCauley, the name he gave to De Niro's character. LA Takedown was strangled by TV budgets, so Heat was Mann finally getting to realize the full vision with a massive ensemble and the scale he'd always wanted. It's the rare case of a director remaking his own work and turning a cramped, dry run into a masterpiece. A Star is Born. By 2018, A Star is Born had already been made 3 separate times, so a fourth go, starring a first-time director and a pop singer, sounded like a genuinely bad idea on paper. The 2018 version was the 4th Hollywood take, following the originals from 1937, 1954, and 1976. Bradley Cooper directed and starred in his directorial debut, opposite Lady Gaga, working from a script by Eric Roth, Cooper, and Will Fetters, with Sam Elliott, Andrew Dice Clay, and Dave Chappelle filling out the cast. It grossed about $436 million worldwide. There's a long Oscar history here too. The 1954 version went home completely empty-handed despite 6 nominations, while the 1976 version won Best Original Song for Evergreen. The 2018 version won Best Original Song for Shallow, its only win despite 8 nominations. This is where the unnecessary charge hits hardest, because how do you possibly justify telling the exact same story for the 4th time? The answer turned out to be casting and craft, and a song nobody could stop singing. The Thing. John Carpenter made what's now considered one of the greatest horror films ever put to screen, and when it came out, critics called it the most hated movie of the year. The Thing arrived in 1982, the second adaptation of John W. Campbell's novella, following the 1951 film The Thing from Another World, which had been directed by Christian Nyby and produced by Howard Hawks, and was a respected sci-fi staple of its time. Carpenter's version was a flat-out commercial failure, making only about $13 million at the box office, with a lifetime gross that stalled just under $20 million. Part of the problem was the worst release timing imaginable. It opened just 2 weeks after E.T. the Extraterrestrial, and a few weeks after Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and it got buried alive by both. The reviews were genuinely brutal, with critics calling it instant junk and a great barf bag movie, but something happened over the following decades. The film was slowly reevaluated into a cult classic, and it's now ranked among Carpenter's very finest work, with many considering it a more faithful adaptation of Campbell's novella than the 1951 film ever was. 40 years after it bombed, anniversary screenings actually landed it back in the box office top 10. And that's the perfect note to end on, because The Thing is the ultimate proof that whether a remake worked is sometimes a verdict history delivers, not a number from opening weekend. Some of these films won on the first night. This one had to wait decades, and it still won. If you got something out of this, consider subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching.